Another form of literature review is the systematic literature review. It overcomes one of the major problems with traditional literature reviews, that problem being the reader doesn't necessarily know or can't necessarily tell if the author is a true expert in the field. The author may be looking for evidence to back up a pet theory, for instance, and the reader won't really know that's what's happening. The systematic review overcomes that problem by being very intentional and specific and explicit about the way that articles are selected to be included or not in the review. So the writer will lay out the paper much as they would lay out a scientific research paper. It's got an introduction saying, why do we need a literature review in this area? It's got a methods section which explains exactly how the sample was selected, and it says how many articles were included, selected for inclusion in this review, how they were identified, why certain articles were excluded, why certain databases were chosen to look for articles, et cetera, and it lays out standards by which those articles are going to be analyzed. So, for instance, the author might specify that we included anything with a p-value less than 0.05, or they might specify we include any result with a p-value of less than 0.01. They'll specify that a priori, in advance, in a methods section, and they might tell you things like, we included unpublished manuscripts, and this is how we found them. Or it might say we looked only at published articles that were indexed in PsycInfo, but we did not include sociological abstracts and ERIC. And then they would have to justify why they made that decision. But they do that explicitly in a methods section before they give you the results. I want to share a couple of examples to maybe illustrate how this works. This is a paper that I published 2 decades ago, so the what it's included might be a bit old, but it was a review of every study that we could find that evaluated the CASA program. CASA is Court-Appointed Special Advocates, and the way it works is to align a CASA volunteer with children who are in the foster care system to kind of track them through their foster care path. And we found, as you can see, we've listed the studies there. The Abramson, the level of evidence we said was 1. The highest level of evidence, it was a randomized controlled trial. The next one there is Calkins, and it's 2, and you can see them listed along the left side of the page there. And we have rated the quality of the evidence from 1 being the highest quality evidence, a randomized controlled trial, down to 4, which is a pretty low quality of evidence. Those would be quasi-experimental designs, perhaps, I forget exactly. They did not control for any covariates. I believe that's what a 4 meant, and a 2 was a quasi-experiment that did in fact make attempts to control for covariates. So we've listed the papers. We have made sort of a summary analysis. You can see the first row there, the Abramson study, the randomized controlled trial, found that children involved in the CASA program with a CASA advocate, they had a higher chance of being adopted and lower chances of remaining in guardianship, remaining in foster care, or later re-entering the system. And there seemed to be no difference between the CASA kids and the non-CASA kids in the likelihood they were reunified with their parents. So the arrows there are kind of indicating the basic results of all of these, of all of those outcomes in that study. And we did that for each study, and you can get to our conclusion at the bottom, which is sort of a subjective analysis of overall where do we think this evidence takes us? What is the conclusion? So in this paper, we have explained exactly where we found all of these papers. Many of these are not published papers. They were solicited by county governments to look at the impact of a trial program, for instance. And so we had to describe exactly how we had access to them, which gives the reader some understanding of what might be missing. We included all of those unpublished papers because we were trying to combat publication bias, which would be in favor of only significant findings. But government reports are often not published, and so we thought that this collection of papers was much bigger than one might assume if they only looked at the published research. That's the kind of result you can get from a systematic review. We've included a lot of things that aren't included elsewhere. We told you exactly how we got them. But when it came to writing the results, it is still relying on the professional expertise of the authors of the paper. One more example of systematic literature reviews. Cochrane publishes entirely systematic reviews on mostly medical topics. Those of us who are interested in children and families can get some useful information from Cochrane because they do write systematic reviews on issues related to children and families. In this one, you can see it's a review of the research on acupuncture for mumps in children. And like I said, it's written like a traditional literature review. You get a background section there explaining that this is very common in traditional Chinese medicine. Their methods, they described exactly what they would accept as evidence. And you see this update aimed to systematically reveal all randomized controlled trials that examined efficacy and safety of acupuncture in children with mumps. So as of December 2014, they looked for studies that met that criteria and found none. There were no studies to review. The conclusion is we don't know anything about the efficacy or safety of acupuncture used to treat mumps in children. And I share this study to convey one of the downsides of a systematic literature review. The systematic literature review can only be as good as the existing evidence allows. And many topics that we care about in child and family science don't have high quality studies already conducted on them. And so the literature reviews aren't going to be that useful. And specifically, a systematic literature review might be less useful in a case like this than would be a traditional literature review written by an expert, because the expert might be able to draw analogies to similar topics and at least give us some indication of where it's going. But a systematic literature review with very rigid criteria for what gets included and not often just isn't going to be able to tell us much. And that's what happened here.